Oh. Good morning, church family. Time to get started. I hope you've had a great week. Ignore the week 15 on the slide. I think it's about 8 months now, not week 15. We've been undergoing a comparison of the four Gospels, trying to see what we can glean from the similarities and the differences between the four authors. We've gotten into the last week, and it's going to take us quite a while to get through the last week because the bulk of the information that the authors wrote about was in that last week. So we still got, I think, 3 more chapters of Matthew to go, and similar in the other 3 authors. Actually, a lot more in John. Last week, we left off with Jesus in Jerusalem in the upper room in the Essene quarter of Jerusalem. It was Thursday. It had turned into night, and they were eating a Passover meal according to Mark and Matthew and Luke, and according to John, it was just before the Passover, and that indicates that they are on 2 different calendars. John is on a different calendar than the other 3. And we're going to start today, or continue today, with Jesus and his disciples in the upper room, continuing with their Passover meal. So this next event, Jesus predicts Judas's betrayal. It is recorded by all 4 authors, and keep in mind that when John records something that the other 3 authors record, that's because he's got something to add to it. He thinks that the others may have left something out, and he's got some insight, 30 years later that the other ones don't have. So let's look for that when we get to John's writing. All 4 wrote about it. Luke's account is the shortest account. And in fact, if you take a look there, it's only 3 verses. And we're going to read his first, then we'll read Mark and Matthew's, and then we'll look at John's account. So Luke, chapter 22, verses 21 through 23. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to that man who betrays him. They begin to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. So that's Luke's account. Mark and Matthew's account is nearly identical with one exception, and we'll get on that on the next slide. And while they were reclining at the table, I underlined reclining just to remind myself to mention that last week I showed you a cartoon picture of what a Jewish Seder looks like. We Westerners usually get our vision of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, and we think of a high table and they were all sitting in chairs, kind of like what we do today, but that's not the way a Jewish Seder was in the first century. The table is low, pretty much close to the floor, and you recline, you lay down on the floor, and you prop yourself up on your left elbow because you're going to eat with your right hand. I'm going to bring that vision up a little bit later when we get to John's account, because it gives us more insight of something that John says. But they were reclining at the table eating, and he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as is written about him." To continue, "But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." And then this next part that's underlined was written by Matthew only. "Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, 'Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi.' Jesus answered, 'You have said so.'" So keep in mind, Mark wrote his account first, and Mark doesn't mention at this particular spot that it was Judas, but Matthew was inspired to let people know it was Judas here that is going to do doing the betraying. And we get to John. John is the longest account, so look for the insight, look for something different that he adds that the rest of them don't. And pretty much what he adds is not in the other accounts is I've underlined. So the underline is me. Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified. So that's underlined. That's something that John put in that the other ones did not. If you read Luke and you read Mark and Matthew, you might not get the sense that Jesus is troubled. It's just another day event. He's with his disciples. He's teaching. John, not only here, but all the way through chapter 18, and we're right now in chapter 13. So for 5 chapters, John is talking about how distressed Jesus is, and you're going to see it time after time after time. So Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is John, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back to Jesus, against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" So now picture the table again. They're all on their left elbow, and John can either lean forward and whisper into the guy's ear in front of him, or he can lean back and talk to the person behind him. And John's indicating he is leaning back to talk to Jesus. So John is sitting at Jesus' right-hand side. Seems like a place that John wants to do. Remember, John has asked repeatedly if he could be on Jesus' right-hand side, and here at the table he is sitting at Jesus' right-hand side. John goes on. Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Remember in Luke's account a week or two ago, Luke indicated that Satan had entered into him at this point. So Jesus told him, "What you are about to do, do quickly." But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said that to him. Continuing on. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival, or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. Now I've highlighted "and it was night" because it seems odd and out of place there. John has already told us previously at the beginning of the meal that it was evening. Now he feels a need, he feels compelled, he is inspired to tell us again, remind us that it's night. Now why would he do that? If this is a Passover meal, then this is a Sabbath. You don't go out on a Sabbath night. You are supposed to be in eating your meal, and Judas is going out. So that's one possibility. Terry, did you have another possibility?
You said that's a Sabbath?
So if it is not a It is not a Saturday Sabbath. It is a special Sabbath. It's the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. So it's treated just like a Sabbath, and you don't go out. So I think, and I may be wrong, that when he emphasizes here, and it was night, as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. I believe he is emphasizing that. Pardon?
Equivalent to Friday. After 6 p.m.
After 6 p.m., it becomes Saturday. Not Saturday, I'm sorry. It becomes a Sabbath. Now, this is the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, so it's a special Sabbath. It is not a Saturday Sabbath. And you don't go out. You are expected, particularly on a Passover meal, to be at home eating the Passover meal. Now, there may be another reason to do that. That's what came to me. Any questions on that before I go on? Okay. So the next event is Jesus establishes the Lord's Supper, and this is recorded by Mark and Matthew and Luke. John doesn't cover it. Suggests to me that John thinks the rest of them have it covered sufficiently, and he didn't have anything to add, or he wasn't inspired to add anything different. One note here about order and chronology. Mark and Matthew place the Lord's Supper after Jesus' prediction of Judas' betrayal. So according to Mark and Matthew, Judas left, and he's not present there for the Lord's Supper. While Luke places the Lord's Supper prior to Jesus' prediction, and again, John is silent. So a slight difference in perception there. Let's look at what happened. Now, the text between the three authors is nearly identical except where I note, and we'll stop and talk about where I note. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." And this next phrase, Luke is the only one to add it. "Given for you, do this in remembrance of me." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you." It continues, but I want to talk about this bit. Luke's the only one that adds this here. Do this in remembrance of me. Luke is a Gentile, and he's writing to a Gentile audience. So one might think that this has a special meaning for a Gentile audience. And indeed, if you think about it, it does. Mark is a Gentile, I'm sorry, he's a Jew, but he's writing to a Gentile audience. Matthew's a Jew writing to a Jewish audience. They were not inspired to include this. Luke was. So what is the significance to this to us Gentiles? To a Jewish audience, Jesus created this Lord's Supper during the middle of a Passover Seder. So in a Jewish audience, when they eat a Passover Seder, they are doing that in remembrance of being delivered from Egypt. But the Holy Spirit inspired Luke to tell us that when we do this in remembrance of the fact that Jesus delivered us from sin. And so that special note there. It continues. "This is my blood on the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." That last phrase is Matthew only. And let's stop and pause there for a second. So Matthew, a Jew, writing to a Jewish audience, felt inspired to tell us that Jesus' blood is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. This is a change for the Jews. They're used to animal sacrifice as being the article that forgives sins. And Matthew is telling the Jewish audience now, it's no longer animal sacrifices. It's Jesus' blood that now atones for our blood. Get on board, Jewish audience, or you're gonna miss out. It continues, and this next section is Mark and Matthew. Luke did not include this. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So Mark is a Jew writing to a Gentile audience. Matthew's a Jew writing to a Jewish audience. They both felt inspired to write this. Luke did not. Last week, I mentioned a similar phrase that Luke had mentioned during the meal, where Jesus made the comment that he won't repeat this again until he does it again in the kingdom, into my Father's kingdom. And at that point, I gave you a Jewish perspective. After class, Terry came up to me and goes, it's fine that you give the Jewish perspective, but you also need to give the Christian perspective. After all, my audience is a Christian audience. So I'm going to give you the Jewish perspective here for Mark and Matthew, and then I'm going to turn around and give you the Christian perspective as well. Terry's absolutely right. I need to provide that. So Jewish perspective first. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new within my Father's kingdom. In a Jewish Seder, by the way, none of this information about a Jewish Seder, how a Jewish Seder is conducted, none of that's in the Bible. So you have to go to secular, particularly Jewish documents in order to find out how a Jewish person would have conducted a Jewish Seder 2,000 years ago. It's pretty much done the same way today. Except for today, they now use a table with chairs. There are 4 cups in the Jewish Seder, and they are taken in remembrance of the promises made by God to the children of Jacob or Israel in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. And I'll read that to you. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, the first promise, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. Second promise, I will free you from being slaves to them. Third promise, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. And the fourth promise, I will take you as my own people and be your God. So there are 4 cups, one each representing these 4 promises that God made to the Jewish people. The first cup is the cup of sanctification. God set the children of Israel apart from everybody else. So they were sanctified, set apart. And that is that first person, I will bring you out. This particular cup is drunk at the very beginning of the Jewish Seder. So before you eat anything, you drink the cup of sanctification. The second cup is the cup of deliverance, and it's from the phrase, I will free you from being slaves to them. It's the cup of deliverance. God delivered the children of Israel from the yoke of Egyptian slavery. And this cup is drunk at the conclusion of the main part of the meal, but before the redemption benediction. The third cup is the cup of redemption. God redeemed, freed, or delivered the children of Israel from Egypt. And this cup is drunk after the redemption benefication and the prayers that are associated with that. And the Jewish perspective is it's this third cup that it was during this third cup of redemption where Jesus says, drink, this is the blood of the new covenant. He's creating a new covenant with this cup. And he is now the redemption, not this redemption that's described here as a part of being Exodus from Egypt. Then the fourth cup is the cup of restoration, or some people call it acceptance, or some people call it the homecoming. God accepts his chosen people as his own. And this cup is drunk at the very end of the Seder after all of the prayers and after a very specific hymn is sung. So this is the last cup. And according to a Jewish perspective, this is what Jesus is talking about when he says, I'm not going to drink of this cup again. Messianic Jews believe that Jesus will participate in the fourth cup after the second coming when God's elect people are gathered together in heaven. That's a Jewish perspective. Now let's talk about a Christian perspective. God's kingdom is already here. Jesus is in charge of God's kingdom. So Jesus participates in this fourth cup, if you will, every time we sit down every Sunday when we have the Lord's Supper. He is participating with us in that fourth because we are now God's elect. And we are now assembled in his kingdom under his name. Any questions there? Make sense? Okay. This next event is the disciples dispute who among them is going to be the greatest. Does this sound familiar? Like it's ever happened before? You may recall that when Jesus and his disciples were coming back from Caesarea Philippi and Mount Hermon on the way back to Capernaum, they were arguing amongst themselves who would become the greatest. And when they got into, I can't remember if it was Bethsaida or in Capernaum, I think it was Capernaum. When they got into Capernaum, Jesus asked about, hey, what were you guys arguing about on the road? And they didn't really want to tell him, but finally they did. And then Jesus brought in a little child and said, unless you become like this little child, you are not going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And if you want to be the greatest, you must be the least. And you remember that. I hope. I see a lot of heads going up and down. So this is another instance where the disciples are arguing among themselves as to who's going to be the greatest. They didn't get it on that trip back to Capernaum. And so this is recorded only by Luke. So look out to see if there's a special emphasis, though, that would be of interest to a Gentile audience. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest." The youngest is the one that serves the older ones, right? "And the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who's at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who sits at the table?" It continues, "But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Let's pause there for a second. Luke is a Gentile, and he's writing to a Gentile audience, and he's writing this language that sounds an awful much like a Jewish author might write to a Jewish audience. If taken literally, Jesus is promising them to sit on thrones and will judge the 12 tribes of Israel. That's the literal interpretation of that passage. But obviously, it's not why the Holy Spirit inspired Luke to include this to a Gentile audience. Doesn't make sense. Would be no reason to be there. That suggests that this is a symbolic message. That Jesus was telling the disciples something symbolic. That symbolism may or may not be clear here. But whenever you've got symbolism in the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, and it's not clear in the one passage that you're reading, it's always a good practice to go somewhere else in the Bible and see if you can find that same language and see if the symbolism is clear there. And if it's clear there, it's that same symbolism is being used here. So let's see if we can find this passage somewhere else. And lo and behold, we do. In James, in fact, we find it in a couple of places, and we'll go over each one of them. In James chapter 1, verse 1, in his introduction to the letter, James uses a greeting to the 12 tribes. Now again, if that's taken literally, it implies that James is writing to a Jewish audience. However, if you start in verse 2 and you read the entire rest of the book, it's very clear James is talking to a Christian audience. He is not talking to a Jewish audience. That is clear, and it's undisputed. Now, there is a little dispute going on amongst Bible scholars as to whether James is talking to a Jewish Christian audience only, or whether he's writing to the entire Christian audience. I personally believe he's writing to the entire Christian audience because what he writes in the rest of his book it clearly implies or clearly is addressed to all Christians, not just Jewish Christians. So here's at least one instance where an author uses this phrase and is using it to describe a Christian audience. If we go to Romans chapter 11, Paul describes that Gentile believers are grafted into the tree of Israel. So, and then he goes on to talk about how we are heirs and all the promises made to Abraham. So Gentiles become grafted into the tree of Israel. So here's another instance where Israel is now used to describe, if you will, the New Testament church or God's elect. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul writes that Gentile believers become citizens of the Commonwealth of Israel. So again, another symbol of Israel being used to describe the New Testament church. Chapter 3, same book, Galatians, Paul writes that if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So again and again and again in the New Testament, we have this reference to either the 12 tribes, in the case of James, or of Israel, referring to the New Testament church. So it's clear to me that when Jesus tells the 12 disciples that he is going to set them up, when he gets on his glorious throne in glory, he is going to provide the 12 disciples 12 thrones so that they can judge over the 12 tribes of Israel. He's talking about setting them up in a place of high honor over the New Testament church, which, by the way, Paul describes the 12 disciples as being the foundation of the church, with Jesus being the cornerstone. So the disciples established the church, and now they're going to be in a place of honor overseeing the church.
And in Galatians 6:16, he specifically states that you are the Israel of God.
That's correct. Yes, thank you. I had forgotten about that one. Chapter 6, right? 6:16. Okay. So, again, time after time, there are plenty of examples of either Israel or the 12 tribes of Israel, being used to describe the New Testament church, both Jewish and Christian members of that church. Any questions there? So that's an example. There's another incident where Jesus says that, and I didn't mention that earlier. That's in Matthew, and it occurs right after the event with the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler comes to talk to Jesus. The rich young ruler leaves Jesus, and he's saddened. The disciples start asking Jesus about some of the things he told the rich young ruler. They become a little surprised, and Peter says, well, then what about us? We've left everything and to come follow you. And Jesus then tells them that the same kind of language here, where he's going to set up 12 thrones and have you judge over the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, if this was just Matthew talking to a Jewish audience, you might incline that maybe then he was talking something different. But when Luke does it to a Gentile audience, it becomes clear what the meaning in both places is.
Have you given any study to why the word judging is used there, when obviously God and Christ are the judges of all creation? In what sense have you discovered that they would sit in judgment?
So it's a great question. And yes, I have done a little bit of study on that. Judge. We in our Western culture tend to use the word judge to mean determining the guilt or innocence of. That is the way we tend to think of judge. But if you look at the Old Testament, the word judge is used at least 3 different ways. And one of the ways is clearly determining guilt and innocence. But you had the judges of the Old Testament who weren't necessarily determining guilt and innocence, but were in places of high honor. And then there's a third definition, but it's just places of high honor that I believe is being used here. The disciples, who are the foundation of the New Testament church, with Jesus being the cornerstone, established the church, set the parameters aside of what the church is supposed to become. They went and they spread the gospels to create the church, and now Jesus is putting them in places of high honor to oversee or preside, or that was the third definition, to preside over, to either preside over or just the positions of high honor overseeing the New Testament church.
Tyre and Sidon stood in judgment over the Israelites because of their penitent attitude. It's like the apostles were preaching a message that would separate between people. Some would respond, some would not. That message would divide. And so to that extent, they served as judicial. They put a message out that would separate between the bark and the tree.
You either believe in Jesus, Jew, Gentile, Greek. You either believe in Jesus or you don't. And that's what separates you. That is, as you put it, that is the rule, the law, the condition, whatever you want to describe it, that serves to judge you, and it was the disciples that set that down. Any other questions or comments about that part? Okay? Then we'll get into Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Surprisingly, this is only included in John. And I said earlier in the class, look out when it's only John, or if John writes about something that the other ones have already written about, to see what is the special insight that he has, 30 years later. And this event, washing the disciples' feet, we all are very familiar with the event, but it was only included by John. John thought that John was inspired to write this because this is very important, particularly to the New Testament church. Again, it was just before the Passover. Clearly, he's on a different calendar. Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Continuing. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Well then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Good old bold Peter, right? Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Verily, truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. A clear message from God through John as how we as Christians need to treat one another. Jesus and the disciples head out towards the Mount of Olives. Mark and Matthew wrote, when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Luke writes, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. Keep in mind, Luke, in several places, I think this is the fourth or fifth one, says that every night Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives. He's continuing with that line here. John doesn't say where they leave. John just says, come now, let's go, or let us leave. So this next event is Jesus predicts Peter's denial. And again, all four gospel writers include this, and they approach it differently. So let's look for those differences. Mark and Matthew list the event as the first event that occurs after reaching the Mount of Olives. Luke and John list the event as the last event that occurred in the upper room before going out to the Mount of Olives. It probably started in the room and probably continued during that walk. Remember, it's a relatively short walk out to the Mount of Olives. In other words, they're both right. Then Jesus told, this is Mark and Matthew. Then Jesus told them, by the way, Mark and Matthew is nearly identical, but is slightly different than what Luke and John put in there. Then Jesus told them, this very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Now, Mark is a Jewish writer. Matthew is a Jewish writer. They both recognize when Jesus quotes Zechariah 13:7, and so they both felt inspired to include that quote. Zechariah 13:7, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Mark and Matthew continue. Peter replied, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the disciples said the same. So now we go to Luke's account. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, in other words, there's going to be a failure. And when you turn back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. Or you will deny that you know me 3 times. Now, John's account. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. He continues. Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? I'll end with this slide. Lord, where are you going? Jesus replied, where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Yeah, I'll end here. Questions, comments?
And Mark, for some reason, says before the rooster crows twice.
You're right. I failed to put that in here. But yeah, there is a difference there. For Mark, it's twice, and, well,
I said
I'll leave it there.
in the sermon, and somebody called me outside and said, no, they didn't crow, but it was 1 time. And that's what Mark says, it's twice.
Mark says it's twice, and John says 3 times.
So, the denial, it's 3 times, but the cock of crow.
Right. Oh, you're right. Right. Other comments? Questions? Okay, we'll start back up here next week, and let's prepare for the